Hi, I'm Dr. Paul Louis Metzger, and I'm the director of New Wine, New Wineskins. Welcome to New Wine Tastings, where every week we'll have an opportunity to engage people from diverse backgrounds, all in the attempt to build relational bridges through Jesus in contemporary culture. We are desirous of the opportunity to engage in deep and meaningful ways, and we're really thrilled and excited to have you with us. Hello, I'm Dr. Paul Louis Metzger, the director of the Institute for Cultural Engagement, New Wine, New Wineskins, and it's my privilege today to introduce you to Dave Cresta, Phil Berlin, and Ross Hallback. And we're going to be dealing with the subject matter of the church and gentrification, and we'll define that for you, and racialization. All these themes in this particular episode of New Wine Tastings, where we seek to build relational bridges through Jesus in our contemporary culture. So Dave, Phil, Ross, thanks for joining us today at New Wine Tastings.
Thank you.
And as we deal with the subject of Jesus and the gentrified church in a racialized world, I want to start out with Dave. Dave Cresta, I had the privilege of working with you on your doctoral research at Portland State University for your doctoral degree. And you've written on the subject of how the church may be involved in furthering gentrification. Could you unpack for us your research at Portland State University and including the book you were writing on this subject for Whiffenstock Cascade?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So I entered my research with a really simple research question. What kind of impact do local churches have on neighborhoods that are immediately surrounding them? So I realized that most church leaders and attendees commonly assume that they're having some kind of positive impact on people, but neighborhoods and cities are much more complex, and they're complex systems, and the role of churches in those systems is not really very well understood. So as a Christian and as a social scientist, I wanted to know what does it look like to bring the good news of the gospel to not only people as individuals, but to the systems that we're all immersed in. So systems like community economics, neighborhood housing markets, residential segregation, just to name a couple. So my research looked at the broad impacts of churches across the entire country. And I was looking for statistically significant relationships between things like church demographics, neighborhood demographics, the level of social service programs that churches provide, the diversity of churches and the diversity of the neighborhoods that they're in, and then looking at how the neighborhoods in which those churches were located had changed in terms of income levels and racial composition over a relatively long time period, 20 years. So I found that churches do contribute to neighborhood change, sometimes positively, but other times negatively. So I'll highlight perhaps my most controversial finding, and namely that churches which have a higher percentage of whites than their surrounding neighborhood are implicated in the process of gentrification. So let me repeat that. Churches which have a higher percentage of whites than their surrounding neighborhood are implicated in the process of gentrification. And as a reminder, gentrification is a type of neighborhood change in which low-income neighborhoods transition to higher-income white neighborhoods that existing residents and other low-income people really can no longer afford to live in and no longer feel comfortable living in. So one way to think about this scenario of churches and their impact on gentrification is to imagine a young couple who's looking for a home to buy in Portland. They're relatively affluent, they're white, looking for a new home and close in as possible in Portland. So nowadays, of course, those homes are largely out of reach for most young couples, but let's go back 10 or 15 years. So this couple finds a neighborhood that looks promising because of some nicely maintained homes, a few that are in disrepair, but overall very nice. A few people who look just like them walking their kids down the street. They turn the corner and voila, a brand new hip coffee shop, some boarded up businesses, maybe a sign for a trendy vintage clothing shop that's going to be opening up soon. And then they also notice a new church that they're familiar with from the suburbs that announces that they're now going to be meeting in a new place. Maybe it's an abandoned warehouse, or perhaps in a closed down church, perhaps a closed down African American church. This neighborhood has a number of things to attract this young couple to that neighborhood, something that social scientists call cultural amenities. And that they make this neighborhood feel like it could be home for this young couple. So the white church likely started with a lot of good intentions to help out the neighborhood, or to plant, simply plant where the next new hot growth area is one of those things that makes this place feel like it's turning in the quote unquote right direction for this couple. And they decide to buy a house while the prices are affordable. So that's kind of the hypothetical situation, which actually isn't all that hypothetical. I mean, it's occurred many, many times over many different cities. And this white church in a non-white neighborhood can actually act as a beacon or a signal to other whites that the neighborhood's ready to move into. So of course, the church isn't exclusively responsible for gentrification in this scenario. There's a lot of other contributing factors, but my research did show that churches are part of that overall collective of neighborhood actors that dictates the direction that a neighborhood takes over the long run. So I got several other findings, as you know, Paul, but I'll leave it at that for now. Maybe some of the other findings will come up as we proceed.
It was a fascinating study, and I can't wait to see the book that comes out that furthers the research and some of the materials that you're developing with it. A lot of quantitative research, and I think there were qualitative aspects. And for the viewers, Dave is an engineer by background, a committed Christian, as are Phil and Ross, and people that are very committed to the local church and have a passion for the city and the broader community. So these are matters that come out of his heart and his life, and musings in terms of how to be missional. And as Dave said, a lot of times we're well-intentioned, and it's not to bash, but it is to build up, and it's also to make us more aware and more engaged in building a community that really accounts for diversity and ethnic diversity, and seeks to really build bridges, not build walls. And with that, I want to draw attention to work and reflections from my colleague Phil Berlin, a longstanding friend as well, who's been a pastoral leader in Portland and grew up in Portland, and has served in African American and multi-ethnic congregations, and is a pastor in the Portland area, and is a leader at New Wineskins, an advisor to me, and tries to hold me accountable in different ways, and is doing a good job, doing a better job than Ross and Dave are, I might add, but that's for another day. But Phil, thanks for joining us in this conversation for New Wine Tastings.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Paul.
And so Phil, as I said, you were raised in Portland, part of the African American church, and as a pastoral leader for a significant time. And you have a passion to tell the rich and resilient stories, and we've talked about this in other contexts, of the African American churches in Portland, in Northeast Portland, North Portland, I should say, and the challenges that the African American Christian community is currently facing, in part as a result of gentrification, and how they are responding. So Phil, please share with us about this vision that God's put on your heart.
Absolutely. Well, as you said, I was brought up in Portland, and my original pastor is someone that moved from the South to wanted to plant a church, a Black church in the middle of a very white community. He came here in the 80s. And he did that. It's a little church called Grace and Truth Pentecostal Church over in Southeast 22nd Avenue. Church is still there now. And as I got older and got a call from ministry, I just wanted to kind of live into his legacy, and just the story of how he came to Portland, and just the other leaders that are coming that have been here and have done just tremendous work. Many of you guys are familiar with one of our fellow seminary graduates from Multnomah, Our father used to pastor a church that's not too far from where I live now. It used to be called Morningstar. It was called Morningstar Baptist Church. It was just off of MLK Avenue. Several years ago, that church burnt down. And I remember just driving past in the neighborhood just the other day, and I saw the Morningstar apartment complex. And I was thinking, wow, there used to be a church that used to be right here. And I just don't want many of the churches, the African American churches that have been here with very effective, passionate, powerful leaders, just wonderful music and just wonderful work that they've done in the communities. Those stories to pass away. Now, Morning Star is one example, but there are several other actual churches in the area that the buildings aren't churches anymore. There's just other things that are going on there. And then in addition to, as Dave brought up earlier, there are churches where there's new church plants that have moved into those buildings, and then that existing church's story has essentially been lost because we don't really know where those leaders have been and the like. So that's the thing. That's the passion behind me, is that I would love for those stories to be told, for just the legacy of that theology that's coming through that has come through the African American church to just continue to be told and continue to have the same passion, and for the new people that are coming to the neighborhood to still know that there's been a presence here. That there's been a presence in the neighborhood, and that church has been a significant piece of it, and not just another piece of property.
Yeah, I'm so excited about what Dave has shared and what you have shared here, Phil, and we'll be bringing in Ross in a minute here about his own work in life and research, and these are things that that really own you guys. And for Phil, just your passion, your vision. When you think about the resilience of the African American Christian community, there's certainly the trauma of the displacement. We can go to Vanport. We can talk about the Central Corridor and how the church and the business community going way back was a vibrant business community in the Central Corridor, where you'd see the Moda Center, where you'd see Lloyd Center in that area, and then the displacement to North Portland, and then now with gentrification, economic displacement, and all kinds of things that play out, and the impact in so many quarters. And yet the story needs to be told, the story of resilience. And that's so important. And Portland's a powerful, beautiful city in so many ways, but there is this other side to Portland that we don't often hear about. It doesn't show up in Portlandia. Certainly New York Times and the Willamette Week and other, CNN has documented it, but we need to keep documenting. I don't know how much has been done. Some has been done, but we need more to be done on the African American Christian experience and the church experience. And Phil, I look forward to hearing more from you and dialoguing further with you and Dave and Ross on this to come. And so Ross Hallback is also a leader at New Wine Wineskin, serves on our board. And in addition to that, he serves in the business community, as a CFO of a company, and so wears many hats. And he's also done doctoral research at the University of Aberdeen on Dietrich Bonhoeffer and on race. And passion for Ross is, gentrification themes and such. And so Ross, please share with us how you and Rachel, you've lived in North Portland, part of the church where Phil is pastored, and we were members, my family and myself were members, and lived in Portland. And this grew on you, this theme of race and racialization in the church and gentrification. And so how does that all come into play for you, Ross, with your research? And I know you have a book coming out on this subject with Baylor on Bonhoeffer and race in the church, and I know gentrification plays into it as well. Please weave that together for us, if you would.
All right, that's a big question. I'll do my best to do some weaving here. I think similar to what Dave has talked about was my lived experience during my time in North Portland, and also seeing the African American churches that Phil has talked about, and just the atmosphere, the aesthetic of the city change over time. It was what I was trying to figure out, and I figured where better to discuss that and dive into it other than in the local church. So the local church that I was a part of we started doing deep dives into discussing race issues. And I think over time, I began to see that my questions about gentrification were closely linked to questions about race. And also began to see that race had really serious explosive effects within the church to discuss it. But that really, when we look at gentrification, to me, it became more deeply connected to race and a question about race. And I turned from gentrification to look at race. And I think part of the complex systems that are behind gentrification are summarized by Ta-Nehisi Coates. I have a quote that I wanted to share.
And the name of the author again?
Ta-Nehisi Coates. Coates writes, "I know that gentrification is but a more pleasing name for white supremacy, is the interest on enslavement, the interest on Jim Crow, the interest on redlining, compounding across the years, and these new urbanites living off that interest are all of them exulting in a crime." Those are pretty potent words. And more than what Coates is directly relating gentrification to white supremacy, I think what he's getting at is the historical backing that informs gentrification. And for me, that became kind of what was behind the systems that Dave's talking about. And my research was just diving into that as deeply as possible, realizing that race is a configuration, it's a system that's already informing our churches, and being frustrated with having good intentions, but it always seeming to come out in bad ways. And how that weaves together with Dietrich Bonhoeffer is, as I started to research race, it seemed as though a lot of the research being done is looking at, okay, here's the problem and here's the solution, which I think is important to delve into the problem and the solution. But the more I dug into it, I realized there is no solution, clear solution, no quick solution. And so part of what my research was about is, how does God work through a church that is configured by race, that is playing into the dynamics of gentrification, and how is God still at work in those places? And how do we listen to God in the midst of that situation so that we have resilience and that we can have those difficult discussions? Because my worry has been, even for myself, is that often it's us jumping to the quick solution that leads to good intentions that hinder and impact people in negative ways, and
Say that
shape.
last sentence again, please. Say that last
that our good intentions often create an impact that hits people in negative ways. Just as Dave shared about the people coming in with the best intentions to want to serve the community and be there, but now as we look in the city of Portland, it's becoming more and more white. And if you really want to be in a diverse community, you have to go around the edges in the suburbs to be with the people that have been pushed out of the city.
Yeah, there's a lot there, and what all of you are sharing is in addition to the work that you're doing, weaving it together, Ross, we're trying to weave it together today with what Phil is sharing and what Dave is sharing and what you are sharing. And so with this, I want to come back to Dave. Dave, you also address ways in which the church can help safeguard communities from the negative aspects of gentrification. And you know, my fear in a conversation like this is that people get paralyzed. It's like that they can just say, well, I guess we're just part of the problem and not part of the solution. And, you know, like Ross said, problem, solutions, cause, effects, they're all important. We need to think through, okay, if someone's already there in Portland, they've already made that transition and they're embedded, you know, what do you say to them? What do you say? And of course, moving beyond just good intentions, we have to have actions and, you know, and holistic awareness and partnership. So what would you recommend that helps people move beyond paralysis and just, you know, shock and apathy to engage?
Yeah, it's a big question as well. So I got a kind of two-part answer to that. First, it's really important, and I mentioned this previously, we have to recognize that churches don't just interact with individuals. Especially in evangelical circles, we stress individual salvation, but we interact with social processes. So, we are neighborhood actors, whether we acknowledge it or not. So first off, we need to educate ourselves on things that typically don't make it into a seminary curriculum, things like affordable housing. I just talked with Reverend Julia Nielsen of Portsmouth Union, and she has essentially received an MBA in affordable housing with the work she's been doing over the past 5 years. Didn't learn any of that in seminary. So kudos to folks like her who are willing to invest in that and learn that. Learning about poverty systems, learning about community development, economic development. So the book that my current book project that I'm working on actually seeks to bring this world of community economic development into a format that church leaders and planners can consume and then apply to their work as neighborhood actors. And community economic development is all about building equitable, sustainable local economies that bring thriving to low-income and minority individuals, people that typically get left behind traditional economic development. So I think that is part of the work of the gospel in our world, and it's up to us to really learn about it. Second, I think it's really important, and I encourage church leaders to seek out and partner with others who care about the neighborhood. We can't be in silos. So here I'm speaking primarily about developing relationships outside of their specific church. So with existing residents, business associations, local governments, community development groups, existing churches, and community activists. So the days of charging into a neighborhood to save it have got to stop. So it's important to enter into those relationships with the posture of a learner and a servant. And I think that a lot of good things will come out of those relationships. We'll be able to bring hope and healing to those neighborhoods, but hopefully without the alienating effects of changes like gentrification.
And further to that, Dave and Phil and Ross, I think it's important, and I think it's built into what you're saying already. When we go into a community, I think it has to be the way in which we don't simply go to, but we go with. We don't impose, we're invited in. We look, as you had said, Dave, to learn, and that we are healed in the process too. I think so often we go in thinking we're going to be the change agents. God needs to change me. And sometimes often God has used diverse communities to show me my control mechanisms, to show me my power dynamics that aren't the power of the cross. And I need to be displaced by my ego, or from my ego, and not displace others. And I think that listening spirit, that posture of a learner, to put ourselves under leaders that are already in the community, rather than to have that kind of Messiah complex that's so down. And you were alluding to that. And I think there's so much I need to learn, so much I need to grow in, and I need diverse communities to teach me, to shape me. And I think that's a key part of your work. And I know you've talked about that, and it'll be in your book that comes out, later this year?
Probably early next year.
Early next year. Yeah, well, I look forward to seeing that, and honored to play a part in that venture with you. And so thank you, Dave. So the three of you provide striking and overlapping inroads, as I think people are seeing, and to engage this subject on the church, gentrification and race, in a way that can prove very meaningful for missional Christianity in Portland and other cities. Because, this is not just Portland where this happens, Portland, Oregon. This is happening across our country, and not just our country, but elsewhere. And so other cities, including our own, facing similar dynamics and trends. Dave, what stands out to you based on what you have heard from Phil and Ross? And then with that, Phil and Ross, what stands out to you about Dave's work? And then also, how do you see the themes of church, and this is to all of you, gentrification, race, and Jesus, coming together in combined play? You've got 1 minute to say all this. No, just So Dave, first you, and then Phil, and then Ross.
Yeah, I'll try to be pretty quick here. So, Phil, I think your story of Morningstar, the Morningstar apartment complex, is really poignant. Some other work I'm doing is looking at how churches are repurposing their buildings and properties, and sometimes this happens because they do it on purpose, and other times it's kind of imposed on them. So this to me is like one example where there's history there, and those who know about the church that used to be in this location will kind of see what the illusion of Morningstar is. But for the most part, people driving by there have no idea what the history of that corner is. So to me, that really stands out, is avoiding those quick solutions like Ross mentioned, and taking the time to learn the history, perhaps to lament, to allow the neighborhood to lament, which is not a really, it doesn't fit into our productive capitalist mentality to take that time. But I think that needs to be part of the solution here as well. And I guess one other thing I'll say is that I think it's Willie Jennings talks about white supremacy as well. And, one of the ways to define that is, if white supremacy are those who can essentially ignore history or paper over it, or bulldoze over history. And I think that works on multiple levels, physical bulldozers, cultural bulldozers, and we like to ignore history so that we can move on. But I don't think that that's the way of Jesus. I don't think that's where the church is called to either. So I really appreciate this notion of history and avoiding those quick solutions.
Thank you, Dave. Phil.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I'm gonna kind of answer the questions in reverse order because I have a question kind of for the group with the first question. So, but secondly, how these themes are coming together that I see at least in Black churches now are that even though churches are becoming, the African American churches that are here, the large African American churches that are still in inner city Portland, have become more commuter churches because the congregation are coming from far and wide to come back into the town to come to their church. There's still the work of the gospel happening in the town. People are still coming to Christ. There are needs in the community. There's needs in those families that are still being met. There are partnerships that are happening, and the gospel is still being told through those things. And the gospel is still being told in those congregations. There's many times, and there's several churches, I should say, where I've seen a younger leader just being taken under the wing of the founding or established leader. And that younger leader is a very passionate, talented individual that's brought to the congregation, that the congregation just loves on and allows to just use their gifts and be power and just be the leader that God wants them to be. So that's something that I've seen, where I see all these kind of things come into play, is that I see new leaders being new leaders that are just being allowed to shine. And then the church's legacy, understanding where they are looking for their next iteration and who they're going to be going forward. So seeing that is something that I see coming together, and that I see actually is a good thing. In some ways, because in some ways it does seem a little bit like the church holding on to their legacy, but they're continuing the legacy through new leaders that the church is adopting and raising up. But secondly, another thing that I see, and I've seen this for a while, where a lot of these established African American churches have become multicultural churches, or they begin calling themselves multicultural churches, and in anticipation of the neighborhood changing. And so I wanted to ask the group this: the term multicultural, what do you guys feel about that term? How it's being used in particular in church? How do you guys feel about that?
Yeah, Phil, that's a great question. I thought about that a lot, and I have a little section in my book about it, and that just comparing multicultural to multiracial, I think often in the literature, multicultural is it's more palatable to most people because it's saying we all have different cultures and we want to bring together the positive aspects of our cultures to create a diverse community. But when you say multiracial, you know, I don't have a lot of things to be proud of about being white. I have some things to be proud of about being German, maybe my European heritage. But when I talk about race, it often talks about the divisions that exist. And so I think often we steer away from talking about multiracial and we talk about multicultural. For me, I like to steer into the issue, the reality. So I think it is important to talk about what makes a multiracial church, where multicultural, we're all entering into a shared space on the same playing ground. With multiracial, it recognizes that we're actually stepping into a shared space that has hierarchy, power structures, controls, and we have to be aware of those things if we want to truly relate to one another. So that would be my response.
Thank you, Ross. Dave?
Yeah, well, I think Ross has thought more about it than I have. So I think my only other comment would be the church has not been a very good example of integration. So a small segment of my research looked at diversity of churches compared to diversity of neighborhoods. And I think the number is like churches are 1.6 times, almost twice as segregated as churches. I'm sorry, I said that churches are almost 1.6 times as segregated as their neighborhoods. So the fact that we have to, like, you know, call ourselves a multicultural church and kind of like act as if that's a, you know, hurrah for us, pat ourselves on the back. You know, we're still so far behind even society, which society in and of itself is very segregated and you know, needs improvement. So I guess I would just call attention to that. We need more of that diversity in our churches because our neighborhoods are becoming more diverse.
You know, if I could add further to it, Phil, you know, I think when you look at the African American community and the resilience and the flexing, the rebounding, you know, that's not an easy move to go toward referring to themselves as a multicultural church community. So I think in terms of dominant cultural dynamics with multi-ethnic, multicultural, it's a little different in terms of the emphasis than when I'm thinking about the African American community, because, you know, one's in a sense damned if one does, one's damned if one doesn't, because if they don't make that move, if you will, what's going to happen? And so they're trying to navigate in this very complex terrain of not being just bulldozed away, to use Dave's language before, and to navigate that, because if they were to call themselves a multiracial church, back to Ross's point, it'd be very hard for a lot of white people to even think about going into it because they know what's in store for them in that context. So it's, you know, it's challenging to think through what's that like from an African American perspective, which I can't quite comprehend. I mean, I can understand it intellectually to some extent, but I can't really truly comprehend that existentially, emotively, and the like. And so I think it's an important question, but you know, race is not just about color of skin. Again, our modern post-European world has, you know, biologized skin color, you know, and pigmentation, and all for the sake of economic gain and power in terms of the non-Western world with colonialism and such, the history of that. And it's not just a liberal conservative thing; it goes beyond that, to say the least, because liberals and conservatives both play into this in the modern world. But I want to say that, you know, race and economics always go together, and I think we have to account for equity when we talk about quote unquote race reconciliation and multicultural. It's got to deal with equity. It's got to deal with power dynamics, which all of you have been saying. So Phil, what thoughts do you have further to this?
Yeah, and just thank you guys all for your contribution there. And as you brought up, Paul, yeah, from an African American perspective, it'd be very difficult for you to understand, yeah, how that happens. But what Ross said, the fact that it's more. This is what's the word? That it's more. I don't know. Is inviting. Use the term multicultural. It kind of brings up what Dave brought up a little while ago towards the beginning, that it does become that you end up seeing a church that's now called multicultural. Now that becomes kind of a green light to come into the community, to go to this particular church, to make your attendance here. So that's just an interesting thought that I had. But by and large, there are several things that churches are doing to adapt, to continue to rebound, and that's been the whole existence of just trying to figure out, our role in this community, at the same time still meeting the needs of the community, whether that is the community by and large, or that's the community of people that are meeting in our church particularly. Churches are still doing that work, and whether it be a backpack drive or a coat drive happening in the fall or in the summer, soup kitchen, those kind of things, soup kitchen, food pantry, I should say, all those kind of work and those kind of things are still things that are happening in the neighborhoods, because there's still people with those needs. Even though the neighborhood has changed drastically, there's still people living in the neighborhood that still has those needs, and people that know when they see a particular church that they can come to that church and expect healing and expect help. So thank you guys.
Phil, yeah, Phil, I'm just excited to hear more from you on this. As a leader, pressing us at New Wine, we need to hear from you, and kind of leading the way for us, so to speak, as we think through, not just the trauma, not just the hardships, but the resilience, the ongoing work, because it's a history of trauma and resilience. And I love your passion for it and the hope that you have, even while you're dealing with the great and real struggles that you and Dave and Ross are talking about. Just two quick things, and then I'm going to turn the conversation in one final direction, and that is, you mentioned Willie Jennings before, and I think as a theologian of culture, speaking, as myself right here, we often genericize the gospel. We don't see it connected to the land. And that's a point that I know you're all familiar with, that with Jennings's work, land is a key aspect, real estate. And, it's the dominant culture, the Euro-American culture, that's often seen the gospel as privatized, individualized, spiritualized, and not connected to the land. But the whole biblical narrative, land is key. And it's an easy way of gaining land by saying that the gospel has nothing to do with politics, has nothing to do with land, has nothing. Well, and who benefits from that kind of individualized, privatized gospel? Dominant culture does. And so we need to account for land in our understanding of theology. And we also need to understand liturgy. And David mentioned lament. We have to lament, like Morning Star, that's like, Phil, your point is well taken. We need to lament that. And Soong Chan Ra has talked a lot for a series I edited with InterVarsity in his book on lament, prophetic lament and lamentations, that, we often celebrate, and there's a place for celebration, but lament, prophetic lament, has to be a part of it. In our liturgy, with our high-paced, driven culture, economic gain, there's no place for lament. There's only celebration. But again, who does that benefit when we only have celebration and not lament? It's not prophetic enough. It's about prophet, and that's not spelled Prophet, but Profit. And we need to be prophetic. And so you're all valued ministry partners and friends at New Wine, New Wineskins, which, as I said earlier, is about building relational bridges through Jesus in contemporary culture. We've engaged the subject of the church, gentrification, and race over the years, and will continue to do so. And I'm really excited about partnering with you, Phil, and Dave, and Ross. And we need to keep going in this regard. And we need to always keep before us this in service to Christ, the church, and community at large, what King would call the beloved community. My question for you as we close, our first of what I envision and hope to have as a series of video interviews with you, is that on this subject is, why should all Christians in our communities, not just in the cities, in the suburbs, exurbs, et cetera, but just wherever we are, why should Christians of all vantage points all contexts, no matter what their ethnicity and the like is, economic status. Why should we as Christians in our communities care about these matters that we're discussing today? And what is one or two things we can do, for starters, to acclimate and address this challenge? Your thoughts, Phil, Dave, and Ross.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. One thing that I think is important is just recognizing the history in the community that we're moving into, knowing that, the community, that there were neighbors there were people there, that there were things happening in that neighborhood. And just because you've moved there 3 years ago, just because you moved there a few years ago, and there's a person you haven't seen in the neighborhood before, doesn't mean that they haven't been there for 20 years. That's what I have in mind.
This is your story, right, Phil? This is your story.
Particularly my story, yes.
Could you just share that? Could you share that, what you shared with me yesterday?
Absolutely. So I moved back into the neighborhood I grew up in about 3 years ago. And yes, there's times where I'll take a walk in the neighborhood, I'll walk in the park, and people are looking at me like, hey, are you new to the neighborhood? And I'm like, no, are you new to the neighborhood? There's a few years ago where I took my daughter trick-or-treating, and every house I went to, I asked all the neighbors, like, how long have you lived here? And they would say, yeah, moved in a couple of years ago and the like. So I got to meet a lot of the neighbors then, but our family has lived in this house since the 80s. And we've been here for a little while. So yeah, that definitely is my story. But just know that there's an existing story here. As people move in and want to change things and want to make the community more appealing to themselves, just know there's a reason for a lot of the things that have happened here. A lot of the buildings that have brand new coffee shops, there was something there before the coffee shop was there. Just be aware of the history that you're moving into, and then begin to appreciate some of that history and try not to lose it as folks are moving in. So.
And Phil, further to that, the other question I'd asked was not only in addition to what you would encourage people to do, but why should people care? I mean, you're a pastoral leader, you've pastored, you're a Bible teacher, you're a biblicist. Yeah. Why should Christians care about these matters in terms of the gospel and the church?
Absolutely. Well, first off, I'm not as you listed off several things I do. At the same token, I'm not necessarily a church planter. I haven't been a person that I felt the Lord calling me to a particular area to do ministry. But as a youth pastor and as a pastor, there is a call to the people that's in the neighborhood. There's a call to the people that are part of the congregation and wanting to know what's going on at home. Just working with kids as a youth pastor. And many of them, I may have just had an experience with them for just a couple hours on a Sunday or in their high school during a lunch hour or something. And I may not have been able to connect with home, but I was always concerned with what's going on at home, what's going on with mom and dad. And being a part of the past couple of churches I was involved with, just meeting the parents and knowing, hey, some of the stuff that you're seeing happening in school or in the community are things that were going on at home, and you wanted to help that family out. Mm-hmm. So I think just being aware of the issues going on in the community, being aware of just the souls that are going on around you is just a call for a minister or a pastor at any place where they're served, any place where they serve.
And I think with what you're saying, Phil, tell me if I'm wrong, is that like with gentrification, there's upheaval. There's geographic upheaval, there's economic upheaval. That means emotional and spiritual upheaval. If you're a pastor, you're going to want to care about the whole person and their whole story and what's going on, right?
Absolutely. Just considering that a family has lived in a house for 10, 15 years and maybe not have owned that house. And then the owner of the house is saying, hey, by the way, I'm selling it. You have 30 days to go. That can uproot someone in such a way that they never, ever get reestablished again. And being able to minister to that and being able to just know that those kind of things happen. I lived in the numbers in East Portland for a few years. As I finished up my time at Multnomah, I was actually out in East Portland. That's where our family lived. And just knowing that there were a lot of friends that I had that used to live in the neighborhood that I found that lived in apartments out there with our family. And then as I moved back and seeing, hey, I'm just actually taking roster of who's actually still lives in the neighborhood. It's been really interesting. And for a lot of those families that have been uprooted, there's been a lot of pain, there's been a lot of hurt, and then a lot of anger and connection to it. So, yep.
Thank you, Phil. And this kind of experience and pastoral care that Phil's talking about is deeply connected to what Dave and Ross are talking about. With Dave's research on urban studies and all that goes into it and the complexities, it's all coming out of this lived experience and engaging this lived experience. And we need to see a connection between theory and practice. And that's what Phil and Dave and Ross are offering us. So Dave, why should people care? And what are one or two things that you'd recommend to be done as we close?
Yeah, real quickly, the people that Phil talked about that are being uprooted and, living in different areas, those are the people that Jesus cared for. Those are the people that were dear and near to Christ's heart. So I think too often Christianity and evangelicals particularly are associated with a certain brand of politics and preserving power, where what we really need to be doing is repenting and giving away power, and really having a renewed heart for those people that Jesus had such a big heart for. So I'd say that's why this is an important topic for all Christians at all times. And it's not just gentrification, because there's going to be something else the next 20 years. I don't know what it is yet, but there's going to be a new type of gentrification that occurs. And so we may be talking about this different topic in 20 years, but the core issue is still the same. It's people being marginalized and displaced, and we need to have a renewed heart for them. So yeah, I guess I'll stop there because I want to hear what Ross has to say as well.
Well, and what would you recommend beyond that? And I think you had some resources too that you wanted to mention.
Yeah, there's I can provide folks with information if they contact me, but really learning about how whole populations of people have been affected by systems right here in America. And these systems have benefited most white, middle, and upper class very, very well. So one example of the book, Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law. So he traces the policies that created this segregated America and the lingering effects of that segregation. And then another is Michael Katz, K-A-T-Z. He's got a book, 25 years old now, The Undeserving Poor. But it's really powerful, and it looks holistically at poverty in America and really enables us to think much more critically about poverty and how it's not solely an individual type of a problem, but it's a systemic problem.
Thank you. And Dave, you had mentioned before we turn it over to Ross, you had mentioned if people want to contact you, because I know that you're developing studies for this and you encourage people. When I've interviewed you at Pathos, you've given your contact. So what is your contact info?
Yeah, you can go to my website, which is just my name. So www.davecresta, that's DAVEKRESTA.com. And there's a contact form there.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dave. Ross, why should people care? Why should Christians and others care about this? And then also, what are one or two matters that you'd want to bring home of what we can do moving out of here, moving forward?
Yeah, I think why Christians should care is because it's at the heart of the gospel. And just a story about that. I remember when at our church in Northeast Portland, there was a diverse church, and as we started to deal with issues of race, our pastor was preaching through the book of James and had specifically messages focused on the topic of gentrification. And we had a number of people in the church that said that the pastor stopped preaching the gospel, that he was no longer preaching the gospel. And I'm all for a gospel that grabs our heart and is God, a personal relationship with God. But the gospel is also about how we relate to one another, how we hear one another. I think what we're all talking about is how do we hear God's voice? How do we see what God's doing in our communities? That's what Dave is doing with his statistical work and the research he's doing. That's what the stories that Phil is telling. And I think what much of has happened in majority culture and with whiteness, what it's done is it's created a buffer that keeps us from actually hearing God speaking to us, God's working in our world. And that to me is one of the most dangerous things, is that often when we're speaking, we're only hearing ourselves and we're not hearing how God is working in our communities. So I think that's one of the most important reasons, is that this is the gospel. This is about how we actually relate to people on a true level, not in a way that we're creating them in an image of ourselves, but really seeing people, really seeing God. To me, that's at the heart of it. What people can do is they can buy all our books when they come out and read them. Yeah, I think, to be honest, I think I often, especially when I'm talking to white people, I think the first thing we can do is work on ourselves, do work within our own communities and on ourselves to understand the history. Because if we come into these conversations without doing that work first, we can cause a lot of harm. And I've seen that happen in my own experience, that I wish we would have done some pre-work before getting into the discussions. And I think also learning that history gives us the ability to go deeper. And I think remembering that God is speaking, even in really difficult situations, is really important to carry us forward. That God wants to work even in our broken, disconfigured circumstances that we've created. God's still active. And so give us ears to hear and eyes to see.
So again, listening, seeing, and to see through others' eyes, and to hear through other voices in their ears, and how they're processing. And when one grieves, the whole grieves. When one rejoices, the whole rejoices. And so empathy, not in some kind of wishy-washy, warm, fuzzy way, but a real entering in and living in shared space with people is what I hear you and others saying. By the way, joking aside, when is your book coming out, Ross?
Well, I have to look over the final copy edits and do the index, but it should be out by the holidays, by the end of this year.
And what's the title of it?
It's called Bonhoeffer and the Racialized Church.
Bonhoeffer and the Racialized Church. And Dave, do you have a title for yours yet?
It's a really catchy title: Community Economic Development for Churches. Working title.
I love it. I love it. I love it. Well, I was going to go with Prayer of Jabez for one of my books, and that was taken. And then I was going to go with Purpose-Driven Life, and that was taken. And so I had a book that was titled The Word of Christ in the World of Culture, Sacred and Secular through the Theology of Karl Barth. So, you know, it's still on my shelf. So, Phil, thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Dave, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ross, thank you very much. Grateful for your friendships and your partnership at New Wine. I hope we do this again. There are so many factors and layers, and to live into it, not just to talk about it, but to live into it in solidarity is key. And so Phil Berlin, Dave Cresta, Ross Hallback, thank you for joining me as we discuss this theme of gentrification, race in the Church of Jesus Christ, and the gospel of Jesus' kingdom. And what does that mean for a city like Portland and other cities like Portland and beyond? I'm Paul Lewis Metzger, the director of the Institute for Cultural Engagement, New Wine, New Wineskins. Thank you for joining us for New Wine Tastings. Blessings to you all.